The transition from crisis to inevitability did not announce itself with alarms. It unfolded through repetition. By early March, the Korean Peninsula had entered a rhythm of tension that no longer spiked headlines. Missile alerts were acknowledged, not feared. Satellite imagery updates were routine. Military briefings replaced speculation with probability ranges. The extraordinary had become scheduled. On March 3rd at 0412 KST, North Korea conducted what it officially described as a suborbital engine validation. Western analysts classified it as a partial-stage ICBM ignition test, terminated deliberately after boost phase. The launch window had been pre-notified. The trajectory avoided Japanese airspace by less than 40 kilometers. The signal was precise. Capability had been demonstrated without provocation, on paper. Within hours, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command elevated readiness levels across Guam, Okinawa, and the Yellow Sea. Bomber task forces were repositioned, not deployed. Language mattered. Deployment implied intent. Repositioning implied caution. The difference reassured no one. At the same time, something quieter occurred. North Korean cyber units initiated low-intensity intrusions into civilian infrastructure networks in South Korea and Western Japan. No systems were disabled. Instead, they mapped redundancies, latency thresholds, and human response times. It was reconnaissance disguised as noise. The activity was detected, logged, and publicly dismissed as nuisance-level interference. Privately, escalation ladders were updated. On March 6th, the United States and South Korea began Exercise Sentinel Horizon, an expansion of a previously scheduled command and control drill. The change was subtle. Live fire components were added, and strategic assets were integrated into simulation layers. North Korean state media responded within minutes, labeling the exercise a rehearsal for regime decapitation. The rhetoric was familiar. The scale was not. 2 days later, North Korea mobilized elements of its strategic rocket forces. Movement was visible, intentional, and incomplete. Launchers dispersed but did not fuel. Warheads were relocated but not mated. It was a posture designed to be seen by satellites and understood by analysts. Ambiguity was engineered, not accidental. The first physical confrontation occurred far from the demilitarized zone. On March 9th, a U.S. Navy P-8A Poseidon conducting routine surveillance over the East Sea reported radar illumination from a North Korean coastal battery. The lock persisted for 38 seconds. No missile followed. The aircraft altered course and continued its patrol. Both sides reported the incident as defensive behavior. Neither side lied. Both sides escalated. Markets reacted before governments did. Insurance premiums for shipping near the peninsula spiked. Semiconductor futures fluctuated sharply. South Korean corporations initiated contingency relocation plans that had existed for decades but had never been activated. The workers were not told why. On March 11th at 2241 UTC, North Korea launched 3 short-range ballistic missiles into the Sea of Japan. The launches were unannounced. All 3 followed depressed trajectories and impacted within designated maritime exclusion zones. No vessels were damaged. The test achieved nothing militarily. Politically, it shifted the equation. The assumption of restraint was no longer valid. The United States responded asymmetrically. Rather than a visible military action, a coordinated cyber operation disrupted North Korean military logistics software for 6 hours. Rail schedules desynchronized. Fuel inventories reported false surpluses. No trains derailed. No depots exploded. The disruption was reversible. The message was not. By mid-March, both sides had entered a phase planners had long warned about: escalation without direction. Decisions were made to avoid weakness rather than to achieve objectives. Each move was justified as defensive, each response framed as restraint. The latter rose anyway. On March 15th, North Korea conducted a high-altitude nuclear detonation simulation, non-nuclear but electromagnetic in intent, using a missile-borne device detonated over the open ocean. Sensors across the region registered the pulse. Communications flickered. Civil aviation rerouted automatically. The test demonstrated an EMP capability without crossing the nuclear threshold. It was a lesson delivered without blood. That night, emergency consultations convened in Washington, Seoul, Tokyo, and Beijing. China urged de-escalation publicly while increasing readiness along its northeastern border. Russia issued a statement calling for restraint and began moving air defense assets in the Far East. No alliances shifted, all contingencies expanded. The final barrier weakened on March 18th. At 06:27 local time, a North Korean medium-range missile malfunctioned during launch and crashed shortly after liftoff, detonating conventionally near its own coastal infrastructure. Satellite imagery showed fire, debris, and emergency response units. Within minutes, South Korean early warning systems registered what appeared to be multiple launches. The data was wrong. The reaction was real. U.S. and South Korean forces elevated to DEFCON equivalent readiness levels in theater. Strategic assets received preliminary execution orders that stopped just short of authorization. Submarines altered patrol patterns. Bombers taxied, then held. For 7 minutes, no one knew whether the war had begun by accident. When clarity returned, something else was lost. Confidence in control evaporated. Commanders no longer trusted time buffers or verification cycles. Automation thresholds were adjusted. Human override windows narrowed. Speed became the governing principle. On March 19th, North Korea sealed its borders completely and declared a state of preemptive defensive readiness. The wording was deliberate. Preemption was now doctrinal. By the end of the week, the peninsula was no longer waiting for war. It was synchronizing for it.
By March 21st, preparation and execution had merged into the same activity. Orders no longer carried future tense. Units were no longer placed on standby. They were simply held. The distinction mattered operationally, but psychologically it vanished. Everyone involved understood that the next deviation, human or mechanical, would not be absorbed. The first sustained exchange began in the electromagnetic domain. North Korean electronic warfare units activated coastal jamming arrays along the eastern seaboard, targeting airborne radar and satellite uplinks. The interference was selective, pulsed, and adaptive. Commercial signals were mostly untouched. Military frequencies degraded unevenly, forcing U.S. and South Korean aircraft to shift to backup systems with narrower bandwidth and slower data fusion. No aircraft were lost. Mission efficiency dropped by 12%. That number circulated quietly through command channels and triggered immediate countermeasures. Within hours, U.S. cyber and space commands initiated coordinated suppression efforts. Several North Korean early warning radars went offline temporarily, not through destruction but through data poisoning. Displays showed clean skies where activity existed and phantom tracks where none did. Operators were forced to cross-check manually. Response times doubled. In modern warfare, that delay was decisive. On March 22nd at 0109 KST, the first kinetic strike occurred. A North Korean long-range artillery unit positioned north of the DMZ fired a limited salvo toward uninhabited buffer zones south of the line. The rounds landed wide of any military installation. The strike caused no casualties. Its purpose was doctrinal, to establish artillery use as active, not theoretical. The response came 47 minutes later. South Korean counter-battery systems identified and neutralized 2 firing positions with precision-guided munitions. The exchange remained localized. Commanders on both sides authorized no follow-on fires. The line held. But the threshold had been crossed. For the first time, fire had been exchanged intentionally between uniformed forces. Diplomatic language shifted immediately. Statements now referenced ongoing hostilities instead of heightened tensions. Legal frameworks adjusted to match reality. On March 23rd, North Korea launched a coordinated missile strike aimed not at cities, but at infrastructure nodes supporting Allied force projection. A salvo of short and medium-range missiles targeted airfields in southern South Korea and U.S. facilities in Japan. Missile defenses intercepted the majority. Several impacts occurred. Runways were damaged. Fuel storage facilities burned. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Casualties were reported, initially without numbers. The United States responded with overwhelming conventional force. Within hours, cruise missiles struck North Korean command and control facilities, missile storage sites, and air defense nodes. The strikes were calibrated. Urban centers were avoided, power grids were spared. The objective was degradation, not collapse. North Korean air defenses engaged aggressively. Several missiles were intercepted. Others reached their targets. One U.S. unmanned strike platform was lost. Its wreckage was broadcast domestically within hours, framed as proof of resistance. International observers noted the absence of civilian imagery. The omission was intentional. As kinetic operations intensified, the civilian world began to feel the war directly. South Korean emergency alert systems activated nationwide. Evacuation drills moved from simulation to practice. Shelters filled, borders closed, commercial flights ceased. The peninsula narrowed into a closed system, its population contained by necessity. On March 25th, North Korea escalated laterally. Rather than increasing strikes along the DMZ, it conducted a submarine-launched ballistic missile test from the Sea of Japan. The missile traveled on a lofted trajectory and impacted harmlessly at sea. The launch demonstrated survivability of second strike assets. The implication was unmistakable. U.S. strategic forces elevated readiness globally. Ballistic missile submarines adjusted patrol depths and positions. Strategic bombers dispersed to secondary airfields. Publicly, officials spoke of deterrence. Privately, planners recalculated timelines measured in minutes. The most destabilizing event came not from a weapon, but from a system failure. On March 26th, a U.S. missile defense radar in Japan temporarily misclassified a North Korean missile launch simulation as an active strike. Automated alerts propagated through Allied networks before human operators could intervene. Civil defense sirens activated in multiple cities. The alert was canceled after 90 seconds. The damage was irreversible. Markets collapsed within the hour. Global supply chains tied to East Asia seized. Energy prices surged. Governments convened emergency economic councils alongside military briefings. The war was now multispectral, kinetic, informational, psychological, economic. North Korea exploited the moment. State media announced that enemy systems had confirmed their own aggression. The narrative reframed the false alert as proof of imminent attack. Mobilization orders expanded. Reserve units were called. Internal security forces redeployed to manage population movement. On March 27th, U.S. and South Korean forces initiated sustained air operations north of the DMZ. Sorties targeted hardened artillery, logistics hubs, and missile support infrastructure. The tempo was relentless. Precision degraded as defenses adapted. Losses mounted on both sides. Names were withheld. Numbers replaced identities. Civilian casualties began to appear despite precautions. Images leaked. Attribution blurred. Each side accused the other of escalation. International mediation attempts intensified, then stalled. Preconditions multiplied. Trust vanished. By the end of March, the conflict had achieved momentum independent of intent. Every strike generated requirements for response. Every response constrained future options. The war was no longer moving toward a decision point. It was expanding outward, searching for equilibrium through exhaustion. The Korean Peninsula had become the primary theater of a global confrontation, not because it was central, but because it was unavoidable. All remaining assumptions about control, restraint, and predictability had been invalidated. The only question left was how far the systems already in motion would be allowed to go.
By mid-April, exhaustion began to compete with escalation. Sortie rates peaked and then declined, not by choice but by physics. Airframes required maintenance cycles that could not be compressed further. Precision munitions inventories thinned. Replacement logistics struggled to reach forward positions under constant threat. The war's tempo adjusted downward, not toward peace, but toward sustainability. North Korea exploited the shift. On April 14th, it initiated a campaign of controlled provocation designed to test the limits of Allied response without triggering immediate retaliation. Short-range rocket launches occurred nightly, irregular in timing and location. Most landed harmlessly in open areas or coastal waters. The objective was persistence. Each launch forced radar activation, interceptor readiness, and political decision-making.
The cost asymmetry favored the attacker. Simultaneously, North Korean internal propaganda reframed the conflict as a defensive endurance struggle rather than a confrontation to be won quickly. The narrative emphasized survival, sacrifice, and inevitability. External pressure was portrayed as proof of legitimacy. Internal dissent became indistinguishable from treason. The population narrowed around the state. On April 16th, the United States expanded economic warfare measures. A coordinated sanctions package targeted remaining North Korean external revenue channels, including intermediaries operating through third countries. Maritime inspections intensified. Financial networks froze accounts linked by increasingly indirect associations. The measures were comprehensive. Their effect was slow. Hunger did not produce surrender. It produced silence. The next escalation came from an unexpected vector. On April 18th, unidentified long-range drones struck a U.S. logistics hub in the Western Pacific, far from the Korean Peninsula. The attack caused limited damage, but demonstrated reach beyond anticipated engagement zones. Attribution was immediate but unproven. North Korea denied involvement. The denial was irrelevant. The precedent mattered more than responsibility. U.S. planners reassessed risk distribution. Forces previously considered rear area assets were repositioned or hardened. The battle space expanded again, this time horizontally. Allies were consulted. Some hesitated, others complied. The coalition held, but strain was visible. On April 20th, a humanitarian crisis emerged decisively. Power outages across North Korea became prolonged rather than intermittent. Water treatment systems failed in multiple regions. Refugee movement toward the Chinese border increased despite security measures. China reinforced border controls and established containment zones. Aid was offered conditionally. Access negotiations stalled. Images began to leak despite controls. Hospitals without power, cities without light, people moving through darkness guided by memory rather than infrastructure. International pressure mounted for ceasefire corridors. Proposals circulated. None gained traction. Trust was absent. Verification mechanisms were disputed. Each side feared exploitation. The most destabilizing event of the phase occurred on April 22nd. A North Korean intermediate-range missile launch was detected on a trajectory consistent with a high-altitude burst. Early analysis suggested a possible EMP configuration. Strategic forces across the region elevated readiness instantly. Civil defense protocols activated in multiple countries. For 5 minutes, escalation thresholds blurred. The missile impacted in the open ocean without detonation. Later intelligence indicated a guidance failure. The distinction between failure and demonstration no longer mattered. Decision windows were shrinking to seconds. Safeguards designed for deliberation were bypassed in favor of speed. In response, the United States issued a private ultimatum through intermediaries. The terms were limited: cessation of missile launches beyond a defined range, monitored pause in artillery activity, and restoration of communications channels. In exchange, strikes would be suspended temporarily. The message was delivered. No reply came. Instead, on April 24th, North Korea conducted its boldest operation of the war. A coordinated saturation attack combining missiles, rockets, drones, and cyber disruption targeted Allied air and missile defense networks simultaneously. The objective was not destruction, but overload. Some systems failed, others adapted. Several missiles penetrated defenses and struck military installations. Civilian casualties were significant. Civilian areas were largely spared, by design. The restraint was deliberate. The message was escalation could continue, but control remained. The United States responded with the largest conventional strike package of the conflict. Over a single night, waves of aircraft and missiles targeted North Korean military infrastructure nationwide. Hardened facilities collapsed, underground networks caved in, communications fragmented. The strike avoided known civilian population centers, but secondary effects spread regardless. On April 26th, North Korea's centralized command structure was visibly degraded.
Regional units operated on standing orders with limited coordination. The regime survived, but cohesion fractured. The war entered a new and unstable equilibrium, high lethality paired with declining control. Global reaction hardened. The United Nations convened emergency sessions without resolution. Protests erupted worldwide, not aligned by ideology but by fatigue. Economies slowed further. Energy shortages spread. Governments invoked emergency powers to maintain order. The war had become a constant background condition. As April closed, both sides confronted the same conclusion from opposite directions. Victory, as defined traditionally, was unattainable. Defeat was unacceptable. Escalation risked annihilation. De-escalation risked collapse. The war no longer demanded bold decisions, it demanded an ending. But endings require trust, and trust had been consumed early, burned away missile by missile, alert by alert. The Third World War did not need to be declared at this point. It was already recognized, not by treaties or speeches, but by the quiet acceptance that this state of conflict might persist indefinitely, shaping a generation that would grow up knowing nothing else.
By early April, the conflict had entered a phase planners had once described as unstable saturation. Force was being applied continuously, but without decisive effect. Targets were struck, repaired, struck again. Losses accumulated without altering the balance. The war had become a system feeding itself. North Korea adjusted its strategy accordingly. Rather than contesting air superiority directly, it dispersed assets into urban adjacent zones, underground facilities, and mobile platforms that appeared, fired, and vanished within minutes. The terrain itself became a weapon. Mountains absorbed blast, tunnels absorbed time. The cost of each strike increased while the return diminished. On April 2nd, North Korea initiated a coordinated special operations campaign south of the DMZ. Small units infiltrated through hardened tunnels and coastal insertion points, targeting logistics nodes, fuel depots, and communication relays. The attacks were limited in scale, but precise. Convoys burned, power substations failed briefly, confusion spread faster than damage. South Korean internal security forces contained most incursions within hours. Several infiltrators were captured, others were killed. A handful escaped. Their tactical impact was minimal. Their psychological impact was not. The perception of rear area vulnerability forced redeployment of frontline units to internal defense roles. The line thinned. The United States responded by expanding the battle space vertically. On April 3rd, U.S. Space Command confirmed that multiple North Korean satellites had been rendered non-functional through reversible means. Attitude control failed. Communications degraded. The action stopped short of physical destruction, but it blinded segments of North Korea's strategic awareness. For the first time, the regime operated partially deaf and blind. North Korea retaliated asymmetrically. That same night, a coordinated cyber attack disrupted civilian infrastructure in parts of the western United States. Power grids flickered. Water treatment facilities switched to manual control. Emergency systems held. No catastrophe occurred. The message was unmistakable. Distance no longer provided insulation. Public discourse shifted. In the United States, debates over proportionality and escalation intensified. In South Korea, unity hardened into fatalism. In North Korea, information tightened to a singular narrative of resistance and survival. Each society adapted differently to the same pressure. On April 5th, a decisive escalation occurred at sea. A U.S. Navy destroyer operating in the Yellow Sea detected a fast-moving surface contact approaching under emissions control. The contact failed to respond to warnings. At close range, it launched multiple anti-ship missiles. Defensive systems engaged immediately. Interceptors destroyed most of the incoming weapons. One missile struck near the aft section, causing severe damage and casualties. The ship remained afloat, but combat ineffective. Within minutes, U.S. forces retaliated against identified launch sites along the North Korean coast. Missile batteries were destroyed. Secondary explosions followed.
Coastal infrastructure burned through the night. North Korea declared the waters a war zone and warned all foreign vessels to withdraw. Compliance was uneven. One neutral cargo ship was damaged days later. Responsibility was denied by all sides. The naval engagement removed the last illusion that the war could be geographically contained. Insurance markets withdrew coverage across the region. Maritime traffic rerouted thousands of kilometers out of the way. Food and energy supplies tightened globally. Governments began releasing reserves. Emergency legislation followed. On April 7th, North Korea conducted its most provocative demonstration yet, a full-range ballistic missile test on a standard trajectory, splashing down deep in the Pacific. The launch was tracked from ignition to impact. The payload was conventional, the delivery system was not. The test proved reach beyond the theater. U.S. Strategic Command elevated readiness levels again. Nuclear forces were not activated, but the distinction narrowed. War plans were reviewed not as contingencies, but as references. The most dangerous moment came not from intent, but from friction. On April 9th, during a high-tempo air operation, a U.S. strike package misidentified a mobile launcher decoy as an active missile unit near a populated area. The strike went forward. The target was destroyed. So were adjacent civilian structures. Casualties were confirmed within hours. Images spread before statements could. International condemnation followed immediately. Allies expressed concern. Neutral states demanded restraint. North Korea seized the moment, announcing that indiscriminate enemy bombing had crossed a moral line. Within 12 hours, it authorized expanded target sets. The response was swift and brutal. On April 10th, North Korea launched a massed artillery and rocket barrage against metropolitan areas near the DMZ. Missile defenses intercepted some. Many got through. Civilian casualties mounted rapidly. Hospitals overflowed. Evacuation routes clogged. The war reached homes. South Korea formally requested expanded U.S. intervention. The United States complied without delay. Large-scale air and missile strikes targeted North Korean military infrastructure nationwide. The campaign shifted from degradation to suppression. Power grids failed across multiple regions. Transportation collapsed. Command cohesion fractured. Yet the regime did not fall. It adapted. Leadership disappeared underground. Orders decentralized. Units operated autonomously, guided by doctrine rather than command. The state narrowed into a hardened core, insulated from pressure by ideology and isolation. By mid-April, both sides faced a reality no one had planned for. Escalation had failed to produce resolution. Restraint had failed to prevent catastrophe. The war could not be ended quickly, nor could it be ignored. The systems driving it, military, political, informational, had aligned into a closed loop. Every attempt to stop generated new instability. Every pause was interpreted as weakness. The Third World War had not arrived with a declaration or a single decisive blow. It had emerged through accumulation, miscalculation, and momentum. And now, with blood spilled too widely to be denied and stakes too high to retreat from, it entered its most dangerous phase, the search for an ending that might not exist. By early May, the war ceased expanding and began hardening. Lines of contact stabilized not because agreement had been reached, but because further movement produced diminishing returns. Every new strike yielded less advantage and more risk. The systems governing escalation had learned their limits through attrition. North Korea no longer attempted large, coordinated offensives. Its remaining military power fragmented into semi-autonomous regional commands operating under standing directives issued weeks earlier. Communication with central leadership was intermittent. In some sectors, it ceased entirely. Units continued to fight not because they were commanded to, but because doctrine left no alternative. Survival equaled resistance. The United States and its allies faced a different constraint. Their superiority remained intact, but political bandwidth narrowed.
Casualty reports accumulated. Ammunition expenditures exceeded pre-war projections. Domestic pressure intensified as economic strain translated into public fatigue. The question was no longer how to win, but how to stop without appearing to lose. On May 4th, an unofficial pause emerged along several segments of the DMZ. Artillery fire decreased not through negotiation but through mutual neglect. Batteries remained loaded. Crews stayed at stations. Nothing was fired. The silence was unacknowledged and therefore fragile. Behind the scenes, back-channel communication reopened through intermediaries with no formal authority. Messages were stripped of ideology and reduced to mechanics, ranges, timelines, verification. What could be stopped without collapse? What could not? The most significant shift occurred not on the battlefield, but in doctrine. On May 7th, U.S. Command quietly adjusted engagement rules to prioritize force preservation over target acquisition. Fewer sorties were flown, precision thresholds tightened, risk tolerance declined. The change was invisible to the public but decisive in tone. The war was no longer being driven forward. North Korea interpreted the reduction not as restraint but as preparation. On May 9th, it elevated remaining strategic forces to maximum readiness and broadcast the posture domestically. The announcement was meant to unify. It achieved something else. It revealed scarcity. Analysts noted the absence of movement normally associated with full readiness. The signal contradicted the statement. China intensified mediation efforts, not publicly but persistently. Its concern was no longer regional stability, but systemic spillover. Refugee pressure mounted. Trade corridors remained disrupted. The war had outlived its utility. Messages passed quietly between capitals. Language softened further. Red lines became conditional. The last major kinetic exchange occurred on May 12th. A misinterpreted radar return prompted a North Korean coastal unit to fire on a perceived naval contact. The target did not exist. The missiles impacted empty water. The Allied response destroyed the firing site within minutes. No escalation followed. No statement was issued. Both sides absorbed the event without amplification. That restraint marked a turning point. On May 15th, limited humanitarian corridors were established under third-party monitoring. Aid convoys crossed borders slowly, inspected repeatedly, delayed by protocol and mistrust. Still, they moved. Power was restored intermittently in major population centers. Information controls remained absolute. Relief did not imply openness. By late May, the conflict entered a condition analysts would later call static war. Hostilities continued at low intensity. No peace was declared, no victory claimed. Forces remained deployed, sanctions remained in place, air defenses stayed active. The machinery of war idled without shutting down. The global consequences, however, did not idle. Economic realignment accelerated. Supply chains decoupled permanently. Defense postures hardened worldwide. Automation thresholds lowered everywhere, justified by lessons learned under fire. What had nearly failed once would not be trusted again to human hesitation. On the peninsula, reconstruction did not begin. Stabilization did. Rubble was cleared only where necessary. Infrastructure was restored only enough to function. The landscape bore the imprint of precision strikes and emergency repairs, not renewal. Time itself felt provisional. No treaty ended the conflict. No ceremony marked its conclusion. The Third World War did not close with surrender or armistice, but with a quiet mutual decision to stop pushing further, for now. The reasons were never formalized. They did not need to be. The war left behind no clear winner, only altered systems and a shared understanding that the margin for error had been far thinner than anyone had admitted. The world continued, but differently, under new assumptions, under constant readiness. History would later debate when the Third World War truly began and when it ended.
Those who lived through it understood something simpler. It never really ended at all.